It was supposed to be a happy night. Our 10th wedding anniversary. I'd been waiting for it for months, planning everything in my head like it would be a little movie moment for us. Dinner at our favorite restaurant, a walk by the lake, maybe a surprise gift from Ethan that would remind me why we made it this far. That's how I imagined it. What I got instead was something I still can't fully believe happened. The night started out normal. The restaurant was warm and soft with candlelight, and the waiter kept calling us a lovely couple. I wore the blue dress Ethan liked and he actually wore a tie, which was rare. He looked nervous, though. He smiled too much, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When dessert came, he slid a small black box across the table toward me. For a moment, I felt that little rush, thinking it was a necklace or maybe earrings. Something small and shiny. Something thoughtful. But when I opened it, there was no jewelry. Just a folded piece of paper. My name was printed neatly at the top, under some government seal. It looked strange. Official. Cold. I unfolded it, trying to understand. It mentioned a reimbursement, a federal operation, asset allocation. I read it twice before the meaning started to sink in. I looked up at Ethan, and for a second, he looked like he wanted to disappear. He said we'd talk at home. His voice was too calm. Too careful. The ride back was silent. The air felt thick, and every streetlight looked sharper than usual. I remember watching his hands on the wheel and noticing they were trembling. That scared me more than the paper did. When we got home, I didn't even take off my coat. I asked him what was going on. He sat down, rubbed his eyes, and said the words that would change everything. He told me he worked for the FBI. For a second, I thought he was joking. I even laughed. He wasn't smiling, though. He said he had been working undercover before we met, and that his architecture job had been a cover story. He said money from our accounts had been redirected to certain operations. That he wasn't allowed to tell me before. I just stared at him. Then I asked how much. How much of our savings he'd given away. He said almost all of it. Almost all. 10 years of saving, planning, sacrificing. Gone. He said the Bureau would reimburse us eventually, that it was just paperwork. He said he did it for something bigger than both of us. I could barely hear the words. I was too busy trying to figure out how someone could look me in the eye every day and lie that easily. He said he didn't want me to tell anyone. Especially not my brother. That part hit me hard. My brother, Michael, is the mayor of Chicago. Everyone knows him as the guy who doesn't back down from anyone. Growing up, he was my shield. My protector. The idea that Ethan didn't even want me to talk to him made me realize whatever this was, it wasn't just about money. It was about something much darker. Ethan said involving Michael would make things worse. That sounded like a threat disguised as advice. I told him I needed air and walked out. The city felt different that night. Too big, too empty. I drove without really thinking and ended up at City Hall. Michael was still there, working late like always. When he saw my face, he didn't ask questions right away. He just told me to sit. I handed him the paper. He read it carefully, twice, then looked up at me with that look he gets when something doesn't add up. He asked when I married a federal agent. I told him apparently, I'd been married to one for 10 years without knowing. Michael didn't laugh or get loud. He just said this wasn't something we could go public with yet. We needed to find out if it was real. If the Bureau really had their hands in our finances. He told me to go home, act normal, and not say anything to Ethan for a day or two. He said he'd make a few quiet calls. He warned me that whatever was happening, it might not just be about Ethan's job. It might be part of something bigger. Something that involved people who didn't want the mayor's sister snooping around. I nodded, but deep down, I knew I wasn't going to wait quietly. I was too angry. Too humiliated. Too betrayed. I drove home and found Ethan sitting on the couch, pretending to read emails. He looked up as soon as I walked in. He asked if I'd gone to Michael. I didn't answer. His face changed. He told me this was dangerous, that I couldn't drag my brother into it. I told him he should have thought about that before stealing our life savings. He started talking again, something about protection, about keeping me safe, but I didn't listen. I walked straight to the bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lamp on and started writing down everything that didn't make sense from the past few years. Every lie he told. Every business trip that came out of nowhere. Every missing deposit. I filled 2 pages before I stopped. The list looked like a stranger's life. Not mine. By morning, he was gone. Said he had meetings. I went through his desk. I didn't even feel bad about it. Inside were papers, receipts, and codes written on sticky notes. A few flash drives too. I took photos of everything and sent them to Michael. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it was something he shouldn't have. Later that day, Michael called back. He said the codes looked like they matched real federal forms, but some of the account numbers didn't trace back to the bureau. They led somewhere else. Private contractors, offshore accounts. He said this wasn't just some mission. It looked like Ethan had been part of something unofficial, maybe even illegal. That's when I realized I wasn't married to an agent helping the government. I was married to someone who might be helping himself. Michael told me to stay calm and keep acting like nothing had changed. To make him think I still believed him. That was hard. Every time Ethan looked at me, I felt sick. But I played my part. I smiled. I asked about his day. I cooked dinner. And while he slept, I dug deeper. I checked bank statements, searched his emails, and found messages sent from fake accounts that mentioned payments, codes, and something about clearing the wife's access. That was the moment I knew he wasn't just hiding money. He was planning to erase me completely from everything we owned. I didn't tell Michael that part yet. Not until I knew how deep it went. I started printing everything I could find and saving copies on a hidden drive. I wasn't going to confront Ethan again until I was ready. Because this time, when I did, it wouldn't be about begging for truth. It would be about taking back what was mine. I didn't know it then, but that was the night I stopped being his wife. And the night I started planning my revenge. The days after that night felt unreal. I still woke up next to Ethan, still made coffee, still smiled when he walked out the door, but inside I was watching every move he made. I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me at breakfast. Everything about him felt staged, from the calm way he talked to the careful way he touched my shoulder like nothing had changed. I wanted to scream, to throw that paper in his face, but I knew better. Michael told me to act normal, to gather proof, to stay quiet until he had something solid. That's what I did. At work I could barely focus. My students talked and laughed, but my head was somewhere else. When the final bell rang, I'd rush home and start digging. I checked emails, bank records, anything I could find. Most of it looked normal at first glance, but when I looked closer, it didn't add up. Transfers that went nowhere, payments to fake consulting firms, deposits from accounts with government tags that didn't exist. I wrote everything down. Dates, numbers, amounts. I filled pages and hid them in the back of a book he would never open. Every night, Michael called. He spoke in short sentences, careful and vague. He said he had people checking Ethan's name quietly, through back channels and city contacts, not through the police. He said Ethan's background wasn't as clean as it looked. Ethan started acting different too. He was tense, watching me more closely than before. Once I caught him checking my phone when I was in the shower. Another time he asked where I'd gone after work even though he never used to care. It was clear he knew I didn't trust him anymore, but he was trying to pretend it was all fine. The silence between us felt heavy. I stopped sleeping in our bed. I stayed on the couch, saying I was grading papers. Some nights, I heard him on the phone whispering in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and sharp. One evening I decided to follow him. He told me he had a late meeting and left around 7. I waited a few minutes, then took my car and followed at a distance. He drove to the north side, parked in front of an old warehouse near the river, and went inside. I sat there in the dark car, heart racing, waiting for him to come out. He stayed inside for almost an hour. When he finally came back out, he wasn't alone. Another man followed him to the car. They shook hands like they were closing a deal. I took photos from across the street. The other man looked rough, not like any FBI agent I'd ever imagine. Later, I showed the pictures to Michael. He didn't recognize the man, but he said he'd have someone run facial recognition quietly. He told me to keep watching and to keep my head down. Days passed like that. Ethan acted calm, almost too calm. One morning he made me breakfast, something he never did. He said he wanted us to start over. I nodded, smiled, and played along. Inside, I was planning my next move. That night I pretended to sleep early, waited until he was out cold, then went through his laptop. It was password protected, but I had seen the way his fingers moved on the keys too many times not to guess. When it opened, my stomach turned. Hidden folders, encrypted files, and one document labeled asset reports. Inside were records of every dollar he'd taken, but not just from us. Other names. Other families. Transfers linked to companies that didn't exist. It wasn't just about the FBI. It was a network, something that used real people as covers to move money around. I copied everything onto a flash drive and hid it in my purse. The next morning I sent copies to Michael from a public computer at the library. When he called later, his voice was tight. He said what I found wasn't small. It connected to people higher up, people even he couldn't touch without causing noise. He said I had to be careful, that if Ethan figured out what I had, he might not let me walk away quietly. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just betrayal, it was danger. I went home that night and acted calm. Ethan kissed my cheek and asked if I was okay. I said yes. I smiled, told him I was tired, and went to bed early. But I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling my pulse in my throat. Somewhere between the shadows and the sound of the city outside, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to destroy him. Not with shouting or crying, but with patience, planning, and silence. He had spent 10 years building a lie around me, but I was about to take every brick apart until it collapsed on him. When morning came, I put on my calm face again. I made coffee, packed my things, kissed him on the cheek, and left for work. But that day I didn't go to school. I went to City Hall. I sat in my brother's office and told him everything I had found. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and said we'd do this carefully. No headlines, no noise, no panic. He said he'd get one of his trusted advisors to connect me with someone who knew how to trace federal accounts quietly. Someone who owed him a favor. That's when I realized Michael wasn't just helping as a brother anymore. He was helping as the mayor. That evening, when I came home, Ethan was sitting at the table with a calm smile. He said he'd been thinking about our future, that maybe it was time for us to move. Somewhere quieter, somewhere far. I nodded, pretending to agree, but inside I knew what it meant. He was getting ready to run. The man I loved was planning to disappear, probably with whatever money was left. I knew I had to move faster. The next morning, I called Michael and told him everything. He said to keep him busy, stall him for a few days while they tracked his accounts. I agreed. That weekend, I told Ethan I wanted to go away with him for a few days, just to clear our heads. He looked surprised but happy. He said he'd plan it. While he packed and made arrangements, I sent every detail of our trip to Michael. The location, the dates, the car we were taking. When Ethan left the room, I looked around the house one last time. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every memory felt fake now. I realized I wasn't sad anymore. I was focused. calm. Ready. Because this time I wasn't walking into another lie. I was walking into the beginning of his end. Then came the call that changed everything and made the world shrink to the size of a single phone line. The voice on the other end said they had found a man in another city who was funneling cash through shell companies and fake invoices. They said he kept records in a file he thought only he could touch. They asked if I was ready for them to move. I breathed and said yes. At that moment patience had to become action. We tightened the net quietly. The inspector put together a small team that knew how to work without flashing badges or shouting into microphones. The forensic accountant traced every dollar with a patience that felt like slow justice. Michael used favors and soft calls to nudge officials into cooperating off the record. Every paper they found was another thin thread tying Ethan to men who lived outside the rules. Each thread made the picture uglier. Reimbursements that should have paid for protective gear instead paid for private jets. Payments labeled as witness relocation ended up as renovations and luxury shopping. A ledger named people I had never heard of and connected them to accounts in places where ownership is smoke and mirrors. I watched it all like a film running in slow motion. The more I watched, the calmer my anger became. I stopped sleeping at home because the house had the wrong shape now. I moved into the small apartment I had rented under a different name, a third floor with a window that faced our street. At night, I watched Ethan's car come and go while Michael sent updates that felt like small victories. The private investigator captured meetings behind restaurants and in parking lots, briefcase exchanges, and men who counted cash like prayer. The rough man from the warehouse turned up in other clips meeting contractors and mailing envelopes across state lines. We fed the inspector everything quietly, not all at once. We wanted a slow collapse that would leave Ethan exposed and without allies, not a loud arrest that might make him desperate. Michael filed emergency civil motions with judges who owed him favors. The motions looked small and lonely on paper, like a worried spouse seeking temporary relief. Even those small freezes tripped wires. Contractors who once moved money without pause suddenly found their transfers blocked. Men who thought themselves untouchable began canceling plans and staring at their phones. Ethan noticed. He cursed and paced and made threats that trembled at the edges. He tried to pay men by envelopes and cash withdrawals he thought impossible to trace, but one of those envelopes showed up on a grainy camera the investigator had placed behind a diner. That clip nudged the inspector to seek a warrant in another city. When they seized files there, the man panicked and tried to shred documents. They had already copied the important pages. Pages that had once read like safety for Ethan now read like evidence. A backup hard drive appeared in a storage locker investigators opened, and on it were records that matched payments from our emptied accounts to a private security firm. On paper that firm offered protection services. In practice it was a money-moving operation. The file named officers, contractors, and a few business people who took cash and wrote it off as expense. Holding that file felt like holding a torch. It lit everything around us. We did not run to the papers. We did not call the cameras. We let the inspectors and quiet prosecutors do their work. We watched seats shift. Men who carried themselves with arrogance began to make apologetic phone calls. The chain of trust around Ethan weakened. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom sometimes. He began leaving early and returning late. Once he spoke of leaving town, starting over somewhere with another name. I smiled and agreed and let the words hang like bait. The inspector asked me to meet in a small room 2 states away. I went and handed over the ledger, the drive, the photos of envelope exchanges and warehouse meetings. The prosecutor looked at the material and folded his hands. He did not say much, but I saw in his posture that he had enough to present to a grand jury. Michael tightened a few more screws, using his quiet power to make sure judges would hear motions quickly and to keep public attention away until indictments could be filed. It felt like chess. Each move was careful. Each move aimed to checkmate a man who had spent a decade playing with other people's lives. I watched Ethan shrink. His swagger and confidence gave way to the fidget of someone who knows his house of cards might fall. He made a last clumsy attempt to buy loyalty, handing an envelope to a man he trusted. That man chose not to touch it and instead turned it over to a contact working for my brother. The chain tightened. The morning the teams moved, they did it without fanfare. A small group surrounded the warehouse, the suburban house, the storage locker. Men with local law enforcement badges and federal placards moved through rooms with clipboards and camera phones. Ethan was not there. He had slipped away, but the evidence in the files, seized hard drives, and surveillance tape was enough to name him in the chain. That afternoon the inspector called and said they had enough to present to a grand jury. I smiled even though I felt hollow. Michael told me to be ready for the slow, public part. He warned that exposure could make men dangerous. I had already built fallbacks and backups. I kept copies of everything in places only I knew. As the net closed, I realized revenge had changed me. It sharpened edges I had not known I possessed. It made me willing to walk through other people's lives with a calmness that surprised me. I was no longer the woman who believed in the goodness of a man with a kind smile. I was the woman who had been stolen from and who would not rest until the loss was returned or until the man who had taken from us could not stand in the sun without people noticing the stains on his hands. Still, there was a quiet mourning that lived beside my anger. I mourned mornings we had planned and never kept. I mourned the idea of children we might have had and trips we put off. That soft grief kept me human. It gave weight to what I was doing. It kept me from becoming a monster. The plan moved forward, but I kept a hand on my heart so I would not forget who I was fighting for. The morning the story broke was gray and slow. I remember sitting in the small apartment with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching a line of news crawl across the screen. Federal investigation into misuse of government funds. The anchor spoke calmly, as if she were reading about the weather, but every word hit me like a drumbeat. They didn't say Ethan's name yet. They said an unnamed federal financial consultant was wanted for questioning in connection to a network of shell companies and false reimbursements. I knew it was him. I didn't smile or cry. I just sat there breathing through the silence, feeling both victory and nausea twist together inside me. Michael called 5 minutes later. He said they had moved faster than expected. The inspector's team had turned the files over to prosecutors who decided to act before anyone could run. They had warrants for arrests in 3 states. The men Ethan had worked with were already in custody. The rough man from the warehouse was caught at a gas station with a bag full of cash and fake IDs. It was almost too easy. I asked about Ethan. Michael said they hadn't found him yet. He had disappeared the night before. I sat there thinking about how predictable that was. Ethan was always one step ahead when it came to saving himself. He probably had a bag ready, cash hidden, a passport with another name. For a while I hated that I had expected him to do exactly this. It meant that even after everything, I still knew him too well. The city changed overnight. Reporters swarmed City Hall asking questions about the mayor's connection to the case. Michael had prepared for that. He told the truth without telling everything. He said his sister was cooperating with authorities. He said the city supported transparency and accountability. That was enough to keep the focus on the bureau and not on our family. Still, cameras followed me for days. People whispered when I walked by. Some offered sympathy, others curiosity. I ignored them all. The inspector called 2 days later. He said they had traced Ethan's credit card to a motel near the Indiana border. By the time they arrived, he was gone, leaving behind a suitcase and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Inside the suitcase they found more documents, handwritten notes, phone numbers, account details. There was also a small velvet box. The one from our anniversary dinner. Inside it was my wedding ring. I had taken it off weeks ago, but somehow he'd found it and kept it. Maybe as a trophy, maybe as a reminder of something he'd already lost. They followed his trail for a week. Airports, car rentals, cash withdrawals. He kept moving, small town to small town, staying just long enough to stay ahead. Each time they got close, he slipped away. The inspector said it was like chasing smoke. Michael told me not to get impatient. He said men like Ethan always run until they hit a wall. He said our job was to make sure every road ahead of him ended in stone. So we built that wall. Quietly. Patiently. The forensic accountant froze the last of the offshore accounts using international assistance. The inspector's team sent notices to customs agencies across the border. Michael reached out to governors and officials through personal channels, giving them just enough information to flag Ethan's aliases. I took the files we still had and prepared a clean timeline of every transaction, every document, every witness. We were turning chaos into a map. Weeks passed. Then one morning I got another call from the inspector. They'd caught him. He was arrested in a small airport outside St. Louis, trying to board a private plane under a false name. He didn't resist. They said he looked calm, almost relieved, as if the running had exhausted whatever was left inside him. The news spread fast. The anchor said his name that time. Ethan Harper, former financial consultant to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. I watched his picture appear on the screen, the same photo we had taken in front of the house on our 5th anniversary. He was smiling in it. So was I. They took him back to Chicago. The trial process started slow, the way these things always do. There were hearings, motions, legal teams trying to narrow the damage. I attended the first hearing out of duty, not curiosity. When he walked into the courtroom, our eyes met. He looked older, thinner, but the same calm expression stayed on his face. For a moment I wondered what he was thinking. Did he hate me for exposing him? Did he understand why I had to? Maybe he did. Or maybe he didn't think of me at all anymore. He didn't speak to me. The lawyers did the talking. They tried to argue he was following orders, that he had been manipulated by higher officials who used him as a front. The prosecutors countered with the files, the transfers, the evidence we had gathered. Every fact was a nail. Every document a new bruise on his case. I didn't feel joy watching it happen. I just felt finished. After court, Michael and I went for coffee in the same small place we used before everything began. He told me the inspector was going to move on to the bigger name soon. Ethan's testimony could open doors. That meant the case would drag on, but it also meant the system would eat itself clean, at least for a while. I asked if it was worth it. Michael said it had to be. He said you can't change what you don't expose. At home, the silence was different now. The air felt lighter. I could walk through rooms without feeling like someone was watching me. The bed didn't feel like an argument anymore. I packed the rest of Ethan's things into boxes and left them for the bureau to collect. I kept one thing though, the folded paper from our anniversary dinner. The one that started everything. I kept it not as a wound but as proof that even the deepest deception leaves a paper trail. The months after the trial were strange. Some days I felt free, other days I felt empty. Revenge doesn't heal you, it just stops the bleeding. But it gave me something no apology ever could, control. For the first time in years, my life belonged only to me. Michael said I should leave the city for a while. Go somewhere quiet. I took his advice. I spent a month near the lake, walking every morning until the wind hurt my face and the water blurred into sky. Sometimes I thought about Ethan, not with love or hate, but as if he were a character from a story I had once read. Someone who existed on paper, in memory, but no longer in my world. One evening I got a message from the inspector. The last of the assets had been returned. The money Ethan had stolen from our joint accounts had been recovered through court orders. It wasn't all of it, but enough to rebuild. He said justice takes time but it arrives eventually. I stared at the message for a long time, then turned off my phone and stepped outside. The lake was quiet, the waves slow, and the air smelled clean. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace that didn't come from revenge, but from release. I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the plans, the traps, the fall. I thought about how a single paper on a dinner table had changed my entire life. I thought about the woman I had been then, and the woman I had become now. I realized they weren't the same person anymore, and that was okay. The old version of me trusted blindly. The new one watched and learned. The city went on. The case became old news. Michael kept being mayor, though with new caution in his voice when he talked about people he trusted. The inspector moved on to other cases. The world forgot my name, which was exactly what I wanted. One afternoon, as I packed to leave the lake house, I found the paper again. It was still folded, still clean. I burned it in the fireplace and watched the ash rise like dust. That was the last piece of him I would ever let stay. Revenge didn't give me my old life back, but it gave me something better. It gave me the truth. And once you've lived in truth, even the darkest past can't pull you under again. The months after the trial moved in slow motion. Time stretched out in strange ways, quiet and sharp. The city kept its noise, the streets filled with new stories, and mine slowly drifted into the background like an echo that had lost its place. Ethan was still in custody, waiting for his final sentencing. I tried not to think about him, but sometimes I caught myself doing it anyway. It wasn't love, not anymore. It was curiosity, like looking at a storm you've already survived, wondering how it ever looked so big when you were inside it. I stayed by the lake longer than I'd planned. The stillness there gave me space to breathe again. Every morning I would walk until the wind burned my cheeks and the waves swallowed the sound of my thoughts. Some mornings I would sit on a rock with a notebook in my lap, not writing anything, just holding the pen like a promise that I was still capable of creating something out of silence. One day, I received a call from Michael. His tone was careful, slower than usual. He said the bureau had started cleaning up the mess, reshuffling departments, auditing accounts, moving files around like a family hiding secrets before guests arrive. He said Ethan had offered to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. That meant he was talking. I didn't ask about what. I didn't need to. The moment I heard that, I knew some people were finally getting nervous. Michael said the inspector wanted to meet me again, privately, to review the last details before the sentencing. He said it would be good closure. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what closure really meant anymore. The meeting took place in a quiet federal office downtown. The inspector looked tired but calm. He thanked me for everything I had done and said the case had exposed more corruption than they'd expected. He said Ethan's cooperation had led to a handful of internal suspensions and a major restructuring. Then he handed me an envelope, compensation from recovered assets. It wasn't about the money, but holding it felt like breathing again. Proof that what had been stolen had at least been acknowledged. When the sentencing came, I went. Not because I wanted to see him, but because I wanted to finish the chapter properly. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Ethan stood before the judge wearing the same expression he always did, calm, unreadable, slightly detached. He didn't look at me. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he couldn't. The judge spoke in that flat tone judges have when they've seen too many tragedies disguised as excuses. 15 years, no parole for the first 10. The words landed with a strange weight. Not light enough to be merciful, not heavy enough to be cruel. Just fair. That was all I ever wanted. When it was over, I stood and walked out before anyone else could move. The corridor outside the courtroom smelled like old paint and silence. Michael caught up to me and asked if I was okay. I told him yes, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. Life after revenge isn't what people imagine. It's not fireworks or final lines. It's quiet. Empty in a good way. You wake up one morning and realize you're not watching the clock anymore, not waiting for the next move, not checking your rearview mirror. You start living forward again. I went back to teaching after a few months. My students didn't know anything about what had happened. To them, I was just Ms. Grant, the English teacher who liked coffee and told too many stories. It felt good to step into a life that wasn't built on secrets. Michael came to visit sometimes. He never talked about the case anymore, and neither did I. We'd sit on the porch, drink coffee, and talk about normal things, city projects, neighbors, the weather. Every once in a while, he'd look at me with that same protective expression he used to have when we were kids. The kind that said, "I'm glad you made it out." One evening, I came home from school to find a small package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a photograph, old, faded, taken during one of Ethan's supposed work trips. He was standing beside two men I recognized from the investigation, and all three were smiling. On the back of the photo were 4 words written in Ethan's handwriting: "It's not over yet." My hands went cold. I sat down on the floor and stared at it for a long time. The package had no postmark, which meant someone had left it there directly. Someone who knew where I lived. Someone who wanted me to see it. I called Michael immediately. He arrived within the hour, calm but alert. He took the photo, examined it, and said we'd have it checked. He didn't say what we were both thinking, that maybe Ethan still had people outside, or that someone else wanted to scare me into silence. The inspector confirmed a few days later that the 2 men in the photo were under investigation but not in custody. That meant they were still out there. He told me not to worry, that it was probably an attempt to rattle me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been reminded of something important. Revenge doesn't always end cleanly. Sometimes it leaves shadows behind. For a few nights, I barely slept. I kept the lights on, double-checked locks, jumped at every sound. But then, something changed. I realized fear was exactly what they wanted. And after everything I'd been through, I wasn't going to give anyone that satisfaction. So I did what I've always done. I planned. I told Michael to increase surveillance quietly, to keep an eye on the edges of my life without drawing attention. I started documenting again, calls, letters, anything unusual. If they wanted to remind me that the game wasn't over, fine. I'd show them that I was still the one holding the board. Weeks passed with nothing else happening. The investigator eventually traced the photo to a security camera outside an abandoned office downtown. A man in a hoodie left the package on the seat of a delivery van that later stopped near my street. They couldn't identify him. But the message had already done its job. It reminded me that victory wasn't permanent. Still, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. I had learned too much to ever be caught off guard again. Some nights I stood by the window of my apartment and looked out at the city lights. The same skyline that had once made me feel small now felt like armor. Somewhere out there, people were still moving pieces, still hiding, still pretending. But I had survived their game once. If they ever tried again, I'd know exactly how to play. The winter that followed felt long and quiet, the kind of quiet that hums under your skin. The case had faded from the news by then, but I knew better than to think the story was truly finished. Shadows don't vanish, they just change shape. I still kept the blinds drawn at night, still listened for the soft click of unfamiliar footsteps on the stairs, and still looked twice at every stranger's face in a crowd. Yet under all that, I felt something stronger than fear. It was control, the kind that comes when you've already seen the worst someone can do and survived it. Michael called every few days, checking in the way big brothers do, half teasing, half worried. He said the inspector had officially closed my side of the case, but that more names were being added to the bigger investigation. Some of the men connected to Ethan's network had started talking. One of them claimed Ethan had hidden backup drives and files somewhere off the grid, insurance in case he ever needed leverage. The inspector thought he was bluffing. I wasn't so sure. Ethan was too methodical to leave without a plan. A month later, I got an email. No name, no subject, just a link and a line that said, "Thought you'd want to see this." My first instinct was to delete it, but curiosity won. The link opened a small archive of scanned documents, financial ledgers, payment schedules, coded messages, all familiar, all tied to Ethan's fake operations. But mixed in were newer files, recent transfers under fresh names, proof that someone else was still moving money through the same network. I forwarded everything to Michael and the inspector immediately. Michael called within minutes, his voice tight with focus. He said the data matched accounts they hadn't been able to access before. It was enough to reopen parts of the investigation. The inspector warned me to stay out of it this time, to let them handle it officially. I said I would. And I meant to. For about a week. Then one night I was grading papers when I noticed a car parked across from my apartment. Same car, same spot, 3 nights in a row. The driver never left. I called Michael again, and he sent a security detail to check. The plates were fake. The car disappeared the next day, but the message was clear. Someone still had unfinished business. That was the night I decided I wasn't going to hide anymore. I went through the backup files I'd kept, the ones no one else knew existed. Copies of everything, every document Ethan had ever signed, every account he had touched, every code he had written in the margins of his notebooks. Among them, I found one name that hadn't come up before, a consulting firm registered just 3 months before his arrest. It was clean on paper, but something about it felt wrong. I read a quiet check through one of Michael's trusted contacts. The firm was linked to an address in Milwaukee. 2 days later, I drove there. The building was small, tucked between warehouses, half the windows boarded up. Inside, dust hung thick in the air. But in the back office, behind a loose panel in the wall, I found what I hadn't even realized I'd been looking for, a metal box. Inside were flash drives, hard copies of ledgers, and one small envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was Ethan's. Inside was a single page. It said, "If you're reading this, you already know everything. I never planned to hurt you. I only planned to survive. Don't let them make you into me." I stood there for a long time, the paper shaking in my hands. The irony hit hard. He'd spent years lying, stealing, pretending to protect me while building a life out of deceit, and now he wanted to leave a warning like it meant something. I burned the note right there on the floor and left the ashes in the box. The drives went straight to Michael and the inspector. They contained records that filled in the last missing pieces, accounts, passwords, contacts, all enough to finish dismantling what Ethan had built. The inspector said it would lead to several more arrests. He asked how I'd found it. I told him the truth. I just followed the lies to their end. After that, the story really was over. The network collapsed under its own weight. The remaining contractors cut deals. The inspectors closed the file. Ethan stayed where he belonged, serving his sentence in silence. For the first time in years, I didn't have to plan or hide or watch. I could simply live. Spring came early that year. The ice on the lake melted into silver, the air turned softer, and the world seemed to breathe again. I sold the apartment and moved into a smaller house near the water, the kind of place that felt like a clean page. I planted herbs on the windowsill, started jogging again, and adopted a rescue dog that followed me everywhere. Life felt simple, beautifully, almost painfully simple. Sometimes I still think about Ethan. Not the man who lied, not the agent or the thief, but the quiet version I used to know before the mask slipped. I think about the small things, the way he folded his shirts, the way he stood at the stove humming when he cooked breakfast. I let those memories exist without hating them. They belong to a past that doesn't have power over me anymore. Michael visited often. He said I'd changed, stronger, sharper, quieter. Maybe he was right. I learned that revenge doesn't just take away pain, it teaches you how to use it. It taught me to pay attention, to see through charm and control, to trust my instincts even when they whisper instead of shout. One night, I stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the last light fade across the lake. I thought about everything, the lies, the fear, the loss, the fight, the fire that burned through my life and left me standing. I realized I wasn't defined by what he took from me, but by what I rebuilt after he was gone. The story began with deception, but it ended with clarity. Not the kind that shines like victory, but the kind that glows quietly, like peace. I had faced every secret, every betrayal, and I was still here, whole, steady, and unafraid. Revenge had started as my weapon, but in the end, truth became my freedom. And for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I felt something pure and real settle inside me. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't his victim either. I was just me. And that was enough. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.